The asphalt had barely cooled when Harlan Stokes turned his truck onto the dirt road that led up to the old homestead on that late August afternoon, and right there, where the morning glories had climbed the iron fence for 3 generations, where his great-grandfather Samuel had planted the first headstone in 1847, there it was. A ribbon of black asphalt covering the family cemetery like a fresh scar, smooth and wet and utterly wrong. He sat in the cab for a full minute without moving. Nettie was already out of the truck, her good church dress still on from the family reunion down in Blowing Rock, her purse swinging from one hand while her other hand came up to cover her mouth. She didn't make a sound, but Harlan could see her shoulders do that little shake they did when she was holding something back that wanted to come out as a cry. Now, the thing about Harlan Stokes was that he didn't rush into things, never had. He was 76 years old, had lived his whole life on this mountain, had buried 3 children and 2 grandparents and watched the world change from his front porch. And he believed that most problems would show their true shape if you gave them time and didn't go charging at them like a fool. But when he got out of that truck and walked toward the asphalt, his knees felt strange underneath him, like they might not hold. The cemetery was small, just 8 graves spread across a 1/4 acre that sloped down toward the tree line. Samuel Stokes, Margaret Caldwell Stokes, Joseph Whitmore Stokes, little Tommy, who only lived 4 days in 1931, grandmother Ruth, his daughter Ellen, who died in 1968, and his mother Violet, Doyen Uncle Jesse, who never quite came back right from the war. Harlan had kept it beautiful, mowed around every headstone, pulled the weeds by hand. Nettie planted flowers every spring, zinnias and black-eyed Susans and those purple cone flowers that came back every year without you asking. They'd fixed the fence twice. The cemetery was a place of care, a place of memory, a place where the mountain air settled gentle, and the morning light caught the old granite at just the right angle to make you feel like you were standing in a room where time didn't move the same way. And now it was paved over. Every Sunday morning, before the asphalt came, Harlan had walked down to the cemetery after church. It was a ritual as old as his belief in God, and older than most of his other habits. He'd come home from the service with Nettie, or change out of his church clothes into work clothes that had been broken in over decades, and he'd take his hand clippers and his work gloves and head down to the 1/4 acre plot where his family rested. The morning sun would still be rising then, and the dew would sit heavy on the iron fence, beating up like 1,000 tiny promises that the day was beginning fresh. That Sunday morning walk was when Harlan talked to his family. Not in any way that would make you think he'd lost his faculties. He knew they were dead, knew they weren't going to answer back in words he could hear with his ears. But there was a conversation that happened in the quiet of the cemetery between a man and the people he loved and the stone markers that held their names. He'd start at the gate, touching the iron with his palm, and feeling the cool metal still dewy and cold in the early morning. The morning glories would be there on good years, their purple flowers opening like small miracles, and Harlan would straighten them on the fence as gently as you'd straighten the collar of a child's coat. Then he'd move into the cemetery proper. First came Samuel Stokes, the founder, buried in 1889. Harlan would kneel there in the soft grass, his knees cracking the way knees do when you get to be 76, and he'd tell Samuel what had been happening that week, how the weather was running, what was growing in the garden, which grandchildren had called. Samuel had founded this place in 1847, had carved out a corner of the mountain, and said, "This is for family. This is sacred ground." And every Sunday Harlan honored that decision by kneeling in the grass and speaking to the stone. Next came Margaret Caldwell Stokes, Samuel's wife, and here Harlan would spend more time. He'd clip the grass back from the edges of her headstone, brushing the clippings away carefully with his hands. Margaret had borne 9 children. That was what made her remarkable. Not that she'd survived, but that she'd loved hard enough to bring that many lives into the world and see them grow. Harlan would tell her about her great-great-grandchildren, about what was happening in the world beyond the mountain, and he'd make sure her flowers were watered and the grass around her grave was trimmed neat. Little Tommy got special attention. Tommy Stokes Whitmore, who lived for 4 days in 1931. Every Sunday, Harlan would kneel at Tommy's grave, and he'd place his big weathered hand flat on the stone, and he'd talk to his nephew like Tommy was still 4 days old, still new to the world, still worthy of the most tender care. "Morning, Tommy," he'd say. And sometimes Nettie would see tears in the corners of his eyes when he came back up to the house. But Harlan never explained them, and Nettie never asked. Some griefs don't need explanations. And then came Violet, his mother. This was the longest stop, the one where the ritual deepened. Harlan would kneel at Violet's grave, and he'd spend time with her in a way that was different from the others. She was the most recent dead, only 7 years gone, and the wound of losing a mother never quite closes even when you're 76 and have lived a full life yourself. "Morning, Mama," he'd say, and he'd put his hand on the stone, and he'd tell her about Nettie, about the granddaughter Lila, about the tomato crop that was coming in strong that year, about the pain in his knees that was getting worse, about how the world was changing in ways he didn't always understand, but was trying to accept. He'd tell her about his fears too, the ones he wouldn't tell Nettie about, the ones that belonged only to a son and his mother, even a son who was old and a mother who was dead. The rest of the cemetery got attention too. Grandmother Ruth got her flowers checked. Ellen got the weeds pulled from around her headstone. Uncle Jesse got remembered, even though his life had been a hard one, and his death had been a sadness no one talked about directly. And Joseph Whitmore Stokes, who died of scarlet fever in 1879 before Harlan was even born, May got the same care and attention as if Harlan had known him in life. By the time Harlan was done, usually 45 minutes had passed. His knees would be stiff from kneeling, his hands would be dirty from the earth, the sun would be higher, and the dew would be mostly dried from the fence, but the morning glories would still be purple and vivid if it was the season for them. And Harlan would stand at the gate one more time, looking out over the 8 graves spread across the small hillside, and he'd think about what it meant to be a keeper of the dead, to be the one still living who remembered them, who honored them with clipped grass and flowers planted in patterns that matched old photographs and stories told to grandchildren who would someday be old and tell the stories to their own grandchildren. Now, that Sunday morning ritual was Harlan's prayer in a way that went deeper than church. It was his covenant with the people who came before him, his promise to them and to the mountain itself, that their names would be remembered, that the ground they lay in would be kept beautiful, that they would not be forgotten. And every Sunday, for nearly 2 decades before the asphalt came, Harlan Stokes had kept that covenant, kneeling in the morning light with his hand clippers and his work gloves and his quiet words to the dead. "I don't understand," Nettie said. Her voice was small. "Harlan, I don't understand what happened." "Somebody did this," he said. He was looking at the asphalt the way you'd look at a stranger who'd walked into your house without knocking. "Yes, while we were gone. The Ridgeview Meadows subdivision had started appearing about 2 years back, across the highway from their place. 62 new homes, they said, Mountain View lots. The only true luxury community in Ashe County. That's what the signs said. Harlan had watched the bulldozers come, and the trees come down, and the roads get paved, and he'd thought to himself that it was the way of things, development coming up the mountain like water, and he'd kept his head down and tended his cemetery, and his wife, and the garden, and the chickens they raised for eggs. The HOA for Ridgeview Meadows had a president named Diane Crenshaw. Harlan had never met her until she showed up at his door about 18 months ago in a hot pink blazer and heels that weren't made for a gravel driveway. She had blonde hair styled up high. No, and the kind of smile that didn't include her eyes. "Mr. Stokes," she'd said, and she had a way of making even a greeting sound like a complaint. "I'm Diane Crenshaw, HOA president for Ridgeview Meadows, just across the way. I hope we're going to be great neighbors." Harlan had invited her in for coffee and pie, because that's what you do, and Nettie had brought out the pecan pie she'd made that morning, and they'd all sat at the kitchen table with the light coming through the window that faced the mountains. Diane had walked around the property first, before coffee, stepping carefully in her heels across the gravel driveway, commenting on everything she saw. "I see you keep chickens," she'd said, not unkindly but with a note in her voice, like chickens were something you'd keep if you didn't have better options. She'd walked past the old pickup truck that Harlan kept parked near the barn, the one he used for feed and supplies, and she'd made a small noise that might have been disapproval, or might have just been the sound of her heel sinking into soft earth. She'd noticed the barn, weathered gray and full of tools and memory, and she'd said, "That's quite an old structure." She'd paused by the fence line, where you could see the cemetery on the slope below, and she'd looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. Then they'd gone inside, and Nettie had brought out the pie, and Diane had sat down at the table still wearing her blazer, like she might need to leave quickly. "The thing is," Diane had said, and she'd waved her fork like she was conducting a symphony, "those neighbors of yours across the highway, they're going to be looking right over at your property. And we're going to need this area to look like what they expect when they pay for a mountain view. Do you understand?" Harlan had understood perfectly. She was saying his cemetery looked like a mess to the people who'd paid $400,000 for a view of it. "It's a family cemetery," he'd told her simply. "Goes back to 1847. My family's buried there. I keep it nice." "It's an eyesore," she'd said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "What happens when the property values in the subdivision go down because people are looking at a graveyard every morning? What happens when someone wants to sell and they can't because of the view? Have you thought about that?" Harlan had not thought about it, because the question seemed to him fundamentally backwards. It was like asking if he'd thought about the property values of the person who lived in his house if his family got sick. The question assumed a relationship that didn't exist. "I've got the right to bury my family here," he'd said. "It's my property." "Of course you do," Diane had said, and she'd eaten another bite of pie, which Harlan noticed she did, despite saying it was an eyesore. "I'm just trying to help you understand what we're up against. Maybe we can work together on a solution." After she'd left, she'd walked back to her car carefully, holding her purse in one hand, and her high heels picking their way through the gravel like she was walking across broken glass. She had paused at the fence line one more time, looking down at the cemetery, and Harlan had seen her make a little note in her phone. Yes, Nettie had rested her hand on his arm after Diane drove away. "Don't let her get in your head," she'd said. "We've got the right." And Harlan had papers to prove it. Deeds and documents going back to Samuel Stokes, showing that this corner of the property had always been designated for family burial. It was old law, mountain law, the kind of thing that didn't need much arguing because everybody understood it. You didn't mess with family ground. You didn't move graves or build on them. That was the way of things. But Diane had sent letters. Curtis Dillard, who lived about half a mile down the road and had been Harlan's neighbor for 43 years, had mentioned that Diane was going around the neighborhood saying that the cemetery was a health hazard. Curtis had laughed when he told Harlan that part. "Might health hazard?" Curtis had said. They were sitting on Harlan's porch, drinking sweet tea that Nettie had brought out. Curtis was 68, a retired mechanic with big hands that never quite got clean, even though he'd been retired for 5 years. "Only hazard I ever heard of was the one to people who went digging up the dead on purpose. Diane Crenshaw probably reads her health information off the back of shampoo bottles." More letters came. There was talk about the cemetery being unmaintained, even though Harlan spent hours every month maintaining it. There was concern about property values and community standards. One letter suggested that it was inappropriate for a residential community to have a graveyard visible from the homes. Harlan had filed everything in the old filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, where Nettie kept her important papers. He'd made sure everything was documented. He hadn't lost sleep over it. Some things you just had to wait out. But there was one evening, about 3 weeks before the asphalt appeared, when Harlan had sat on the porch by himself after Nettie went to bed, and he'd felt the weight of it. Not the letters or the nonsense about eyesores, but the weight of being 76 years old and knowing that there were people who looked at what he loved and saw something that needed to be erased. And for a moment, just a moment, he'd wondered if he was fighting a losing battle, if the world was going to pave over everything that mattered, and there wasn't any amount of patience or documentation or doing things right that could stop it. Then he'd sat there in the dark with that thought until near midnight, when Nettie had come out in her robe and sat down beside him without saying anything, and after a while she'd said, "Come on, honey, let's go to bed." "I'm tired," he'd said, and she'd understood that he wasn't talking about being sleepy. "I know," she'd said, "but we're not done yet." The reunion was at a pavilion in Blowing Rock, about 30 miles away. The extended family, Harlan's cousins and their children and grandchildren, people he saw once a year at this gathering, had brought covered dishes and stories and the kind of easy joy that comes from being around your own people. Harlan's granddaughter Lila was there, 9 years old, with her mother, Susan. Lila was the joy of Harlan's life. She looked like her grandmother Violet, calm, with serious dark eyes, and a way of listening to you, like what you were saying, mattered. That Saturday morning, the paving crew arrived at the cemetery while Harlan and Nettie were 2 hours away at the reunion. Curtis Dillard, who was home the day fixing a fence on his property, heard the truck rumble past his place around 8 in the morning. He walked out and saw it turn up the driveway to Harlan's place, and he felt something in his chest tighten that he couldn't quite name. Curtis was 78 that year, though he'd only recently admitted it. He'd been a mechanic for 44 years before retirement, and his hands still had the permanent stain of engine oil underneath the fingernails, no matter how much he scrubbed. He was weathered the way men get weathered, who spend their lives outside and don't complain about it, and with sun damage on his neck and white hair that he kept short and practical. He'd been watching Harlan's property for months now, ever since Diane Crenshaw showed up in her hot pink blazer. Curtis had a sense about these things. He'd spent his life dealing with people who wanted to cut corners and take shortcuts, and he didn't like the way Diane looked at the cemetery. It was the same way people looked at a car they wanted to strip for parts. So, Curtis was drinking his coffee on his front porch when the truck arrived, a white pickup with equipment in the back and 2 men in the cab wearing the look of workers who were just doing a job. Curtis watched them pull up to the cemetery and unload equipment, a roller, a compressor, bags of something dark and sealed. He set down his coffee and walked over. "What are you fellas doing?" he called out. The foreman, a man named Derek, who Curtis would have recognized as competent if they'd been on better terms, showed him the work order. "Walking Path Construction," it said. "Ridgeview Meadows HOA, approved by Diane Crenshaw, HOA president." "You sure about that?" Curtis asked, though he already knew the answer. Derek wouldn't have shown up if he hadn't been sure. That wasn't how these things worked. "It's right here," Derek said, and Curtis looked at the signature, that sharp, angular handwriting that he'd learned to recognize from the letters that kept arriving at Harlan's place. Curtis's stomach dropped. He walked back to his property and called Harlan. No answer. They were at the reunion, phones probably left in the car. Curtis left a message, then he called again at 9 o'clock, and another message, and again at 10 o'clock, with more urgency in his voice. But Harlan still didn't pick up, because Harlan was present at his family gathering, the way a man should be, not checking his phone every 5 minutes like some kind of modern person. Curtis couldn't go over there and stop them himself. He'd thought about it, seriously thought about it, about walking over with his old mechanic's authority and telling them to shut down. But he knew it wouldn't matter. They had the paperwork. They had the authority. All Curtis could do was watch. So he paced his property. He walked back and forth from his house to the fence line, back and forth, his hands clenching and unclenching, watching the activity at Harlan's place. By 11 o'clock, they'd started the mixing. The asphalt truck pulled up around noon. Derek was directing the pour, showing his men where to lay it down, and Curtis could see the dark material spreading across the cemetery like a stain spreading through cloth. He wanted to call the sheriff, but Boyd wasn't Harlan's problem yet, wasn't his concern. Curtis didn't have standing, he just had to watch. By 1 o'clock, the asphalt was being rolled smooth. Curtis sat on his porch with another cup of coffee, the one he'd made hours ago, and kept reheating, and he watched the headstones disappear one by one under the dark pavement. Samuel Stokes vanished first, the oldest grave, the one Harlan tended first every Sunday. Then Margaret Caldwell. Then little Tommy Stone, the smallest one, the one that always seemed to need the most care. Curtis felt something break in his chest, a small breaking sound that only he could hear. And by 2 o'clock, it was done. The crew packed up the equipment. Derek came over to Curtis's property and said, "Work orders complete," like Curtis was some kind of supervisor, and Curtis just nodded because he didn't trust his voice. The truck pulled away around 3 o'clock, and Curtis was left staring at the asphalt that had covered Harlan's family cemetery. He called Harlan one more time, but the phone went to voicemail, and Curtis left a message that said, "Don't come home unprepared, I'll be here," because that was all the warning he could give. Curtis sat on his porch for the rest of the afternoon, watching the asphalt cool and darken and harden into permanence. He didn't move. He didn't make dinner. He didn't do anything but sit there and feel sick about what he'd seen and couldn't stop. There's a thing that happens when your whole world shifts. For a moment, everything looks the same. The mountains are still there. The light is still falling the same way. The air still smells like it did that morning. But something fundamental has changed, and you understand in that moment that you can never go back to the way things were before you knew what you knew. That's what it was like for Harlan when he saw the asphalt. He called Sheriff Boyd Messer right there from the yard. Boyd had been sheriff for 16 years, and before that, he'd been a state trooper, and before that, he'd been a boy growing up on the same mountain where Harlan had grown up. They went back to third grade, to fishing trips, to the funeral of Harlan's father, and the birth of Boyd's first son. "It's a cemetery, Boyd," Harlan said into the phone, and his voice sounded old to his own ears. "They paved my family cemetery." There was a long silence on the other end. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Boyd said. While they waited, Harlan and Nettie stood in the yard. Nettie was crying now, the quiet kind of crying she did, the kind that looked like her heart was breaking in slow motion. Harlan had his hand on her back, rubbing small circles like he used to do when any of their own children were hurting. "It's not gone," he said. "The graves are underneath. It's still there." "But it is gone," Nettie said. "You can't get to them anymore. You can't fix the flowers. You can't kneel down and say hello to them." He had no answer to that, because she was right. Boyd came up the driveway in his truck, got out without hurrying, and looked at the asphalt for a long time without saying anything. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with gray starting to show in his dark hair. He wore his uniform with the kind of weight that comes from knowing what responsibility means. "Who ordered this?" he asked. "HOA president named Diane Crenshaw," Harlan said. "Ridgeview Meadows subdivision across the highway." "And you didn't authorize this?" "I did not." "You've got documentation that this is your family cemetery?" "I do, in the house." Boyd nodded. "Get me the papers. I'm going to need to talk to her, but you've got a clear case here. This is your property. These are your graves. What she did is destruction of property and desecration of human remains. That's serious business." It took a moment for that to sink in. Criminal charges, desecration. Words that should have been reassuring, but instead made everything feel even more real and more wrong. Over the next few days, the story started to move like a stone rolling downhill. Harlan brought Boyd the deeds and the property documents. Roy Graybeal from County Code Enforcement came out and took photographs and measurements. And then, almost as an afterthought, or so it seemed, the Ashe County Historical Society got involved. That's when everything changed. Margaret Hollifield was the director of the Historical Society, and she was the kind of woman who didn't make a big show of knowing things, but who, when she spoke, made you realize you'd been missing something important. She was in her 60s with gray hair that she wore practical and short, and eyes that looked like they'd read every old document in the county and understood what they meant. She called Harlan on a Thursday morning. "Mr. Stokes," she said, "I've been looking at the registry records from 1978. Your family cemetery was officially registered with the Ashe County Historical Society 46 years ago. That makes it a protected site under state historical preservation law. When someone paves over a registered historical cemetery, that's not just property destruction. That's a violation of state law, and there are penalties." "I didn't know about the registry," Harlan said. "I mean, I knew I had the right to the land. I didn't know it was registered officially." "It was," Margaret said. "I can show you the paperwork. It's all very clear. And when Miss Crenshaw did what she didn't just break your rules. She broke the law." Margaret came out to see the cemetery the next day. She brought another woman from the society and Roy Graybeal, and they walked the perimeter of the asphalt, looking at the edges where the stone and earth met the black pavement. Margaret had her hand on one of the headstones that was partially visible at the edge. "Samuel Stokes," she read. 1821 to 1889, founder of this cemetery. 1847 is when he was buried, Harlan said. "But he lived from 1821. I'd like to write up a full history of this place," Margaret said. "For our records? You have time to tell me about each grave?" So Harlan told her. He told her about Samuel and how he'd come from Virginia when he was 26 years old and claimed this land and built the first cabin right over there where the woods were now. He told her about Margaret Caldwell Stokes, Samuel's wife, who bore 9 children and lived to be 83 and died of pneumonia in the winter of 1887. He told her about Joseph Whitmore Stokes, who died of scarlet fever when he was 16 years old, buried in 1879, and about little Tommy Stokes Whitmore, who only lived 4 days in 1931 because his lungs never filled with air right, and about grandmother Ruth, who made the best blackberry cobbler and sang hymns while she worked in the garden, and about his daughter Ellen, who was taken by cancer when she was only 42, and about his mother, Violet, who lived to be 91, and died peacefully in her sleep in her own bed. And about Uncle Jesse, who came back from Korea, changed in ways that the whole family tried to love him through, but who finally couldn't find peace in the living world anymore. Margaret wrote it all down in a little notebook, and when Harlan was done talking, she just sat there for a moment and then said, "This is a sacred place, Mr. Stokes. This is the literal foundation of your family, and someone tried to erase it." Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, because this story is proof that some ground is sacred no matter what any board says. Subscribe to the HOA Trap for more. 2 weeks after Harlan found the asphalt, on a Tuesday morning in early September, Nettie was in the spare bedroom going through the filing cabinet. She was looking for the deed, the original deed from Samuel's time. It's the one that clearly laid out the cemetery plot. It was important now, more important than it had ever been. The lawyers needed it. Boyd needed it. She opened the second drawer of the filing cabinet, the one where Harlan kept old documents and receipts and things he wanted to preserve. And there, tucked behind a folder of property taxes from the 1970s, was a manila envelope with handwriting on the front. The handwriting was her mother-in-law's. Violet's careful, slanted script. Ashe County Historical Registry, 1978. Nettie's hands began to shake. She opened the envelope. Inside was a historical registry certificate, the kind issued by the state, official and official-looking, with a seal at the bottom and a date of registration. June 15th, 1978. It documented the Stokes family cemetery as a site of historical significance, nay, going back to 1847. It listed all the graves. It established protections under state law. It was everything they needed and more. Violet had registered it. Harlan's mother, 46 years ago, had walked down to the Historical Society and registered her family's cemetery. Harlan had never known. He'd lived his whole life with this protection in place, had tended the cemetery every Sunday, had never needed to know about it because it was already taken care of, already protected by the woman who'd come before him. Nettie carried the envelope out to the porch where Harlan was sitting, staring at nothing, the way he'd been staring since he came home to the asphalt. His face was weathered and tired and old in a way she'd never seen before. "Harlan," she said. He looked up at her. "Look," she said, and she handed him the envelope. He opened it slowly, like he was afraid of what he'd find. But what he found was salvation. What he found was his mother, 46 years in the past, making a decision to protect her family's ground in perpetuity. What he found was the document that would change everything. When he finished reading it, he set it on his lap and he cried. Not the quiet tears that men are supposed to cry, but real tears, the kind that come from deep in the chest and shake your whole body. Nettie sat down beside him and held his hand. "Your mother," Nettie said. She knew. She knew this might happen someday. She knew, Harlan said. She knew to protect it. 2 weeks later, there was a letter from the county attorney's office. It detailed the violations in legal language. But the meaning was simple. Diane Crenshaw and the HOA had violated state historical preservation law, and they were being ordered to cease immediately all work on the property and to restore the cemetery to its original state. The estimated restoration cost was $78,000. Criminal charges would be filed for desecration of human remains. But before the criminal process could go further, Sheriff Boyd Messer and Margaret Hollifield made a visit to Diane Crenshaw's house. Diane lived in the new subdivision, in one of the homes she'd helped develop. It was a modern structure, all clean lines and new materials, nothing like the old homestead where Harlan lived. Boyd pulled up in his patrol truck, and Margaret followed in her car. Diane answered the door in her hot pink blazer, and the same one she'd worn when she came to Harlan's place months before. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was perfect. She looked like a woman who was sure of her place in the world. "Mrs. Crenshaw," Boyd said, and he was in full uniform, and his voice had the weight of authority in it. "I'm Sheriff Messer. This is Margaret Hollifield from the Ashe County Historical Society. We need to talk to you about the cemetery you paved over." Diane's face went pale, but she invited them inside. They sat in her living room, which overlooked the mountains where the cemetery was located. Margaret laid out the paperwork. She showed the 1978 Historical Registry certificate. She explained that desecrating a registered historical site was a felony under state law. I didn't know, Diane said, and her voice was small, in a way it had never been when she was talking to Harlan. I didn't know it was registered. I thought it was just a family cemetery on private property. That doesn't matter, ma'am, Boyd said. The registration is public record. It's been on file for 46 years. Margaret explained the restoration estimate, $78,000 to remove the asphalt, expose the graves, restore the cemetery. She explained that the Historical Society would need to be involved in the process to ensure proper restoration, according to the original design. Can't you just leave it? Diane asked. Can't you just leave the asphalt there and access the graves through pathways? No, Margaret said firmly. The cemetery was designed with open sky and direct access. That's not something you compromise on. Diane sat down on her sofa, and for the first time since they'd met her, she looked like an ordinary person, a person who'd made a terrible mistake and was beginning to understand the weight of it. What happens now? She asked. You're going to be charged with desecration of human remains, Boyd said. That's a felony. You're going to need a lawyer, and you're going to pay for the restoration. Diane didn't say anything. She looked out the window at the view she'd worked so hard to protect, the view over the mountains. And the view now felt like a curse rather than an accomplishment. The news got out, the way news does in small towns. People started taking sides. Most of them took Harlan's side, because most people understood that you don't mess with family graves. The local paper ran a story with photographs of the asphalt over the cemetery, and Margaret Hollifield quoted the historical significance and the state law that had been broken. But some people in the subdivision had different feelings. They'd bought into Ridgeview Meadows because they wanted to be part of something new, something that felt separated from the old mountain ways. And now the old mountain was winning, and they blamed Diane for starting it. If this story has your blood boiling, share it and subscribe to the HOA Trap. Because what this quiet man does next is why you never pave over a man's people without asking. Diane Crenshaw hired a lawyer. The lawyer sent letters saying that Diane had believed the property was within the subdivision's easement and that she'd been acting in good faith to improve the property. And the lawyer argued that the cost of restoration should be split. The lawyer said that perhaps the cemetery could be preserved under the asphalt with a protective layer, and that Harlan could still access it if pathways were cut. None of it made sense. You couldn't kneel at a grave through asphalt. You couldn't maintain flowers. You couldn't bring your granddaughter to say hello to her ancestors. What the lawyer was suggesting wasn't preservation. It was erasure with permission. In October, about 6 weeks after the asphalt was laid, Harlan's granddaughter Lila came for her weekend visit. She was 9 years old and had the kind of serious way of moving that made you know she noticed everything. She came up the gravel driveway in her mother Susan's car, and Harlan was waiting on the porch the way he always was. "Hi, Papa," she said. And she hugged him, like she meant it. They had their usual routine. Nettie had made cookies. They sat in the living room for a while and talked about school and about the new book Lila was reading about a girl who lived in a lighthouse. And then Lila said, "Can we go see the graves? I want to put flowers on them." Harlan looked at Nettie. Something passed between them without words. "Come on, honey," he said to Lila. They walked out to the cemetery together, Harlan's hand on her small shoulder. And when they got there, when Lila saw the asphalt covering where the graves had always been, she stopped walking. "What happened?" she asked. "Some people made a mistake," Harlan said. "They paved over where our family is buried, but they're still there, underneath. They're still there." "But I can't see them," Lila said. I can't put flowers on them." "I know, baby, but we're going to fix it. We're going to make it right again." Lila was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That wasn't kind." "No," Harlan said, "it wasn't." That night, after Lila was in bed, she'd fallen asleep on the couch during a movie, exhausted by the emotion of the day. Harlan and Nettie sat on the porch together. Nettie had a sweater pulled around her shoulders, even though it wasn't really cold. "She asked about the flowers," Nettie said. "I know." "What are we going to do, Harlan?" "We're going to let the law do its job," he said. "And then we're going to restore the cemetery. And then we're going to live our lives the way we always have, taking care of what's ours." "But it costs so much," Nettie said. $78,000. "We don't have that." And that was the truth. Their savings had gone to medical bills over the years. They lived on Social Security and were fine with what they had. but $78,000 might as well have been $1 million. Then we'll figure something out, Harlan said. We always do. The community stepped in. Nettie's church took up a collection. Curtis Dillard organized a fundraiser at the community center with local musicians and a potluck dinner. People Harlan had known his whole life, and people he'd never met came and donated and told him they believed what Diane had done was wrong, and that his family deserved to have their graves honored. The local news station sent a camera crew out. Harlan didn't want to be on camera, but they got him anyway. That standing in his yard, looking at the asphalt with his cap in his hands and his voice quiet when he said, "This is where my family is. This matters." The story went online. It was picked up by regional news outlets, and then it started getting picked up by national news outlets. HOA president paves over historic cemetery, the headline said. Woman faces criminal charges for desecrating family graves. By the time the story had traveled, Diane Crenshaw's name was known in places as far away as California and New York. Her lawyer tried to settle. Diane would resign from the HOA. The HOA would pay the full restoration cost. Diane would pay restitution. In exchange, the criminal charges might be reduced. But the state attorney general's office was involved now because this had become a matter of historical preservation law. And they weren't interested in going easy. They moved forward with the criminal charges. Desecration of human remains is a serious felony. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button. It takes 1 second, it's free, and it helps the HOA Trap reach more folks who know what it means to honor the ones who came before. Now, back to the story. Diane Crenshaw's trial was in January. The courtroom was packed. Harlan sat in the front row, with Nettie on one side and Curtis on the other. Margaret Hollifield testified about the historical registry. Roy Graybeal testified about the measurements and the photographs. Harlan testified about his family and his property rights and what he'd come home to that August evening. Diane looked smaller in the courtroom than she had in her hot pink blazer. She wore a dark dress and had her hair pulled back, and she looked like someone who was understanding, finally, what she'd actually done. Her lawyer argued that she'd acted in good faith, that she'd believed the property was under the HOA's control, that the situation was a matter of miscommunication rather than intentional desecration. But the evidence was clear. She'd sent the work order. She'd known about the cemetery. There were emails showing that she'd discussed it with other HOA members, calling it an eyesore that needed to be addressed. The jury was out for 3 hours. When they came back, they found Diane guilty of desecration of human remains. They also found her guilty of destruction of property. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in state prison. Although this was suspended in exchange for her agreeing to pay full restitution of $78,000 plus additional fines, and to resign from the HOA and any position of authority in Ridgeview Meadows. She pleaded guilty to the charges in the end and accepted the sentence. In her statement to the court, she said she understood now that she'd been wrong, that she'd let ambition and a desire to develop the property override her respect for what should never be disrespected. She said she was sorry. Whether that was genuine or just what a guilty person said, Harlan never knew, and it didn't matter much to him either way. What mattered was that the restoration could begin. The company that had done the paving, they weren't the ones who'd made the decision. Just the ones who'd done the work, volunteered to remove the asphalt at no charge once they understood what they'd been part of. They came in early March when the mountain was still cold, but starting to think about spring. The grinding and scraping took 3 days. They removed the asphalt layer by layer and carefully exposed each headstone as it appeared beneath. When the last of the asphalt was gone, Samuel Stokes's grave was revealed whole and unchanged. And little Tommy's grave, and grandmother Ruth's, all of them, 8 graves in the earth where they'd always been, protected by stone and the weight of time and the stubborn refusal of one man to let them be forgotten. Harlan and Nettie walked the cemetery together once it was cleared. Nettie cried, but this time it was the kind of tears that meant something was being put right. They touched each headstone, saying hello to each person who rested there. "Your mother would have liked to see this," Nettie said. "She's seeing it," Harlan said. The grass had to be replanted. The soil had to be loosened and amended. Curtis brought over some of his old mechanic's know-how and helped with the landscaping. Margaret Hollifield from the Historical Society helped them research the original layout, and they planted flowers in patterns that match what old photographs showed had been there decades before. If the HOA Trap has become part of your week, think about joining the channel membership. Just a couple bucks a month keeps these stories coming. Links below. Now, back to the story. On a Saturday in late April, when the spring wildflowers were starting to bloom all across the mountain and the air smelled like growth and rain, Lila came for her weekend visit. She was carrying a bouquet of flowers that she and her mother had picked from the spring market. Zinnias and black-eyed Susans and some other flowers that Lila couldn't quite name, but that were beautiful anyway. "Can we go put flowers on the graves now?" she asked Harlan as soon as she arrived. "We sure can," he said. They walked out to the cemetery together, and this time there was no asphalt between them and where they needed to be. The graves were open to the sky. The headstones were cleaned and gleaming. The flowers were ready to be planted. Lila went to each grave and placed flowers carefully, saying each person's name as she did. Samuel Stokes, Margaret Caldwell Stokes, and Joseph Whitmore Stokes, little Tommy, grandmother Ruth, Ellen, Violet, Jessie. She knew the names because Harlan had taught her the stories. She knew who they were because they were her family, and family was something that didn't disappear just because someone tried to pave over it. When she was done, she stood up and looked at her pawpaw. "Is it better now?" she asked. "It's better," he said. And it was. The cemetery was restored. The graves were honored. Diane Crenshaw had left Ashe County and moved to Florida. And the new HOA president in Ridgeview Meadows issued a formal apology and even contributed additional funds to a fund established to maintain the cemetery in perpetuity. The story died down in the news cycle. Life went on the way it always does. But something had changed too. In the subdivision across the highway, if people started taking their out-of-town guests to see the restored cemetery, it became a place of pilgrimage in its small way. People learned about Harlan's family and about the law that protected historical burial grounds, and they understood that there were some things that couldn't be erased just because someone with power decided they should be. After the restoration was complete, Harlan's Sunday morning ritual returned. He walked the cemetery the same way he always had, on Sunday mornings after church, tending the graves with hand clippers and a quiet devotion. But now there was more of a sense of triumph in it too, a kind of quiet vindication in each blade of grass he clipped, each flower he tended. The morning glories came back to the iron fence, climbing it with wild purple flowers the first full spring after the restoration. Now, one afternoon in late summer, Curtis Dillard helped Harlan build a bench near the fence. Curtis had never really worked with wood before. His life had been spent under the hood of cars, but he brought his mechanics' problem-solving to the carpentry, and they built something sturdy and beautiful. It was simple oak, stained a deep color, with room for two people to sit and look out over the cemetery and the mountains beyond. Harlan sat on that bench often, especially at sunset. This was a new ritual, added to the ones that had always been there. He'd sit on the bench in the golden evening light and talk to the graves in a different way than he talked on Sunday mornings. On Sunday mornings, it was maintenance and care, and the conversation of a man tending the things he loved. But on the bench at sunset, it was something deeper. "As we held the line," he'd say to Samuel, the founder, "we held what you started. Your great-great-grandchildren know your name now, and they know you matter." He'd talk to little Tommy about how the world had tried to erase him, tried to cover him with asphalt, and how Tommy was still here, still remembered, still part of the family story. He'd tell Violet about how she'd protected the cemetery with that registration in 1978, how she'd been thinking of him even when she registered it, how she'd known somehow that protection would be needed someday. "You were the wise one," he'd say. "You saw what was coming." The evening light would catch the iron fence, now repainted by someone from the Historical Society, a fresh dark green that made the morning glories show even brighter when they bloomed. The iron fence had come full circle. It had protected the cemetery for 3 generations. The asphalt had tried to make it irrelevant, but it was back, and it would protect what lay inside for however many more generations would come after Harlan was gone. The mountains in the distance would turn blue as the light faded, and the evening glories on the fence would close up their flowers, getting ready for night. And Harlan would sit on the bench Curtis built, his old hands folded in his lap, and he'd feel the weight of what it meant to hold the line, to be the one who said no when someone tried to erase, to be the one who kept the covenant even when everything seemed impossible. The birds would start their evening songs, the temperature would drop, and Harlan would sit there, quiet and still, feeling the presence of all the people who came before him. All the people he'd protected by his stubbornness. All the people who would be remembered because he chose not to let them be forgotten. Harlan Stokes lived to be 84 years old. Nettie lived to be 91. They spent their final years the way they had spent all their years together. On the mountain, taking care of what mattered, honoring the people who came before. And the cemetery remained whole and cared for. A small corner of North Carolina where the dead were remembered and the living kept their promises to the people who had made them possible. Thank you for watching. If this story reminded you that the dead still have rights and the living better respect them, please share it. Subscribe to the HOA Trap for more stories about folks who protected what matters most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you came home and found your family's graves under asphalt?